Good morning, grace and peace to you as we gather for live worship and virtual worship on a gorgeous Vermont summer morning, and we welcome you to worship. This is the Reverend Barbara Ann Lemmel of the United Community Church of Morrisville, and it's her second to last Sunday with you all. And we are both, we are mourning that, but also with you celebrating and welcoming your new pastor coming in. My name is Mitchell Hay, and I'm the pastor of the Essex Center United Methodist Church. And it is great to have all y'all here with us.
Good morning on the second day of summer. The solstice was yesterday, and the weather is just glorious. This morning, we want to start out by sharing a quote with you by Eugene Peterson from his book, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, which is his phrase for what it means to live a life of faith, that it's a long obedience in the same direction. And he writes, all the persons of faith I know are sinners, doubters, uneven performers. We are secure not because we are sure of ourselves, but because we trust that God is sure of us. And that phrase always rings true with me. If I had to be sure in life or secure in life because I was sure of myself, I would be in trouble. It's nice to know that we have someone else that we can depend on. Mm-hmm.
Which reminds me that today is also Father's Day. And for those of us who have fathers, we give thanks for those who have been there for us. Absolutely. And trust in us.
Persons who are our fathers or not, right? So you don't have to technically be a father to be a father.
Absolutely. Many of us have played that role regardless of our gender for other folk. And we've had people who have fathered us with people of other genders, just as on Mother's Day, we also celebrate mothers of every stripe. It's a role, it's not a gender. And we give thanks for those who have played fathers in our lives, and we give thanks for all the ways that God is father and mother to us all. The best parents are the ones who let us be who we are at our most authentic self, but also is not content to leave us there, but always calls us to deepen and grow. And that's how we invite you now to worship. We invite you to come as you are. Come to this worship. Come take your place with sisters and brothers virtually around New England, around Vermont. Come take your place, but come as you are.
And when you come, take off your shoes, figuratively if you like, or literally if you like, because this ground where you are sitting or standing, where all of us are sitting or standing, is holy. This air around you shimmers with the Spirit's gifts. So come and take off your shoes.
Come lay down your burdens. You don't have to carry them here. If you like, set them down gently so as not to break them, and then Jesus can carry them for you. Come, lay down your burdens.
And come, take off your masks. Maybe that's easier to do in our socially distanced settings, but take off your masks because God knows you inside and out. All of you is holy. So come, take off your masks.
Come as you are. Come. The reading from the New Testament from the epistles today comes from Paul's letter to the Church of Rome, his theological masterpiece, and it's been read and misunderstood and argued over for almost 2,000 years now. We're going to be reading a paraphrase from Eugene Peterson that many of you know and love, called The Message. I was speaking about Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of Paul's letter to the church at Rome, where Paul talks about new life freed from sin. Eugene Peterson uses a wonderful metaphor of the new country. So Paul's talking about baptism and how we, in baptism, we die symbolically, just as Jesus died. We are buried with Christ in a death like Christ's, so that we might have a resurrection with Christ, just as Christ is resurrected, to a new life, which Eugene Peterson calls a new country. And so we'll be reading from that translation.
And hopefully you figured out where we are. We had technical difficulties, and so we might be on a different Facebook page than you were on before. But if you miss things, you can catch up later. So this is the audio translation, or this is the message paraphrase. So what do we do? Keep on sinning so God can keep on forgiving? I should hope not. If we've left the country where sin is sovereign, how can we still live in our old house there? Or didn't you realize we packed up and left there for good? That is what happened in baptism. When we went under the water, we left the old country of sin behind. When we came up out of the water, we entered into the new country of grace, a new life in a new land. That's what baptism into the life of Jesus means. When we are lowered into the water, it is like the burial of Jesus. When we are raised up out of the water, it is the resurrection of Jesus. Each of us is raised into a light-filled world by our God so that we can see where we're going in our new grace-sovereign country. So ends this reading.
That being buried in water reminds me of a story from when I was, I think 12 years old. We were living in Connecticut. We lived on the Pocatonic Cove. And there weren't a lot of rules in my house, but one of them I remember was never take the canoe out without letting my parents know that I took the canoe out. Because it was a very long cove and a big body of water. Well, one night my parents went to an officers club event down at the Navy base, and I decided to take the canoe out while they were out on the party, and I had a wonderful evening. It was beautiful until a giant black wall of storm came up across the hill, and I was on the far side of the cove, about a mile from home, and the wind piped up to, it felt like 60 miles an hour, but it was probably 20 or 25, and I could not beat my way into the wind with the canoe. Every time I got it aimed right, the wind would blow the bow across, and I was stuck in the marsh, and it was starting to get dark, and I was scared. And just as it was starting to get quite dark, I saw a white light bouncing across the waves from around where our house was. And it was my dad in our outboard. And he had managed to see me. They came home early because of the storm. And they saw the canoe missing, got in the boat and went with the wind, right about, figured I would be where the wind was keeping me from getting back, and he found me. Not a word was spoken on the rough trip back. We tied up the canoe, we beat our way back to the dock, and we didn't say anything. And I figured we weren't saying anything because he was getting ready to unload on me when we got back home. And when we got back home, he didn't say anything. And I finally said, "Dad, aren't you going to yell at me?" And he said, "I can't say anything that the wind has not already taught you tonight." And I learned several things. My eyes were open to several things. One, that the water is an amazing teacher.
And unforgiving.
And unforgiving. Second, that I learned what being a parent was. My eyes were open to what the whole dad thing was about, in a sense. I guess I'd always thought that rules and discipline were what dads were about. But there I learned that a father or a mother is not a cop there to enforce the rules. They are a teacher there to teach you a way of living and a way of life and a way of deep wisdom. Rules are not for their own sake. Rules are there to help create a mature, responsible, loving, gentle adult. I learned that was what the rules my parents were trying to instill in me and my brother. And it was a powerful lesson that day. I learned something about dadding, and I learned something about canoeing and about water. You don't mess with it foolishly.
Yeah, it's a good story. In that piece that we read from Romans, the line that sticks with me is, "We packed up and left there for good."
Mm-hmm.
And Paul is talking about the life of sin that we packed up and left there for good. But it makes me think of times in my life and my family's life where we've packed up and left there for good. I am the offspring of immigrants into this country. So on my father's side of the family, well over 100 years ago, the Moors came over here to escape the Irish potato famine and settled in eastern Nebraska. And on my mom's side of the family, her father's family, the Ebkes, came over from Germany. My grandfather was the youngest of 10 children, and he was the only one born in the United States. The rest of his family emigrated here from Germany. And the thought of emigrating to central Nebraska with 9 children is amazing to me. Those were folks who decided they needed to pack up and leave where they were for good. They knew there was no going back. And then I think there's times where we pack up and we leave for good and we don't necessarily realize it. So when I decided to go to seminary, when I was called to seminary, I chose to go to seminary in Boston. I grew up in the Chicago area. And Chicago has good schools, but I decided to come to Boston because I'd never lived on the East Coast. And I fully intended to go back to Chicago, fully intended to go back to the Midwest. And then I met this guy in seminary. And, life just goes its directions. And so I have ended up on the East Coast ever since. Mm-hmm. So I did not pack up and leave Chicago thinking I was never going back to that country. But that's what happened to me, right? I never really ended up going back, though my heart is still a Chicagoan and will always be, I think. And it makes me think of the United Community Church of Morrisville. Because you all, I'm talking to the Morrisville folks here now, sorry to you Essex folks, you all have been 2 congregations who over a period of time decided to pack up and leave your separate countries and join a country together. So that now you have moved to a place where you're one congregation managing 2 buildings and 2 histories and 2 sets of practices, all of those things. Sometimes it's smooth, sometimes it's bumpy. But I don't think that anyone's ever seriously considered going back to the old country. When you all left that old country, you entered into a new place for good. You're not going back. That's some of what Paul is talking about, that kind of leaving for a new place.
I don't think Paul ever says it explicitly, but my interpretation when he talks about the old country or sin is it's less about broken rules. And I think that's what I discovered that night in the canoe. It's not about broken rules. Sin is broken relationship. And when we are in Christ, we leave that place. We make relationship primary. I think that's happening in our whole nation. People are saying, we're not going to go back. We're not going to go back to the way it was. Where our nation is over these last several weeks is is different and needs to be more different. We can't go back. We are recognizing that our nation, which has such promise, we're this radical experiment in democracy, but that promise is not distributed evenly. There are people who are left out, and they are beginning to have a louder voice. And there's something about this incredible synergy of COVID and Black Lives Matter, of seeing immigrant children still locked in cages and sleeping on concrete floors, trans folk getting fired. People are saying, no, the promise is for everyone. And Paul does say that explicitly. Even corporations are looking with new eyes at the way they do business, looking with new eyes at the racist tropes at some of their products, realizing that they may not be meeting the needs of all of their potential customers, but even more so as a nation and as people of faith. The promise of our nation, the promise of grace, the promise of faith, the promise of what the church should be about is for everyone. God's promise, God's grace is for everyone.
So some of what Paul is saying is that once we've seen sin for what it is, for a breaking of relationship with God, we see it with new eyes, and we can't go, what we've seen, we can't unsee, right? Except willfully and by lying to ourselves, right? And so that's true with sin. I think that's true with our country. We're seeing things, especially we white folk in the United States are seeing things that other folks have seen for a really long time. And we're seeing it, maybe not for the first time, but certainly differently. We're seeing the possibilities of making something better. We're seeing what our part has been, whether we intended it or not. And we're seeing what our part can be. And that forgiveness that Paul promises through God, the freedom that our country promises, is for everyone, not just for a few.
So we're seeing that promise for white folk especially, with new eyes, because I pray we're hearing the voices of people of color. We're hearing the voices of gay, lesbian, transsexual, queer, bisexual folk. We're hearing their voices that are teaching us how to see with new eyes.
So you talked about how you saw parenting in a new way as a child,
right?
When your dad didn't punish you, but just said, the wind already did that for me,
right?
I also think that becoming a parent helps us see in new eyes, right? And there's lots of ways to see things in new eyes, but I know that powerfully in my own life, I didn't think our lives wouldn't change when we had children, but I had no idea how much our lives would change. And I had no idea how impossible it would be to go back to our pre-parenting country, right? That once one has left that country, there's no going back. Even if, heaven forbid, something were to happen to our children, we don't get to go back to being that pre-parent person, right? And I can remember when our oldest was maybe 4 or 5 months old, suddenly getting it, that I didn't get my old life back, and just sitting in a chair for a long time saying, oh, much as I love the new life, it can be a struggle.
But realizing there is no returns policy.
Yeah, there's no return policy.
They're much tougher than Amazon that way.
And so we want to share with you a video that was made by the StoryCorps project, which you may be familiar with. You can hear StoryCorps podcasts on National Public Radio. And this is the story of Albert and Aiden Sykes. Aiden's a 9-year-old boy in this video, and he's interviewing his father, asking him a variety of questions that a 9-year-old might ask his dad. And so we just fell in love with this video, and we wanted to share it with you this morning. And so, Jeremy, if you'd put that up, we'd appreciate it.
Do you remember what was going through your head when you first saw me?
I remember when the doctor pulled you out, the first thing I thought was that he was being too rough with you. And he actually held you like a little Sprite bottle, and he was like, "Here's your baby." That was the most proud moment of my life. Don't tell your brothers, because it's three of y'all. But it was like looking at a blank canvas and just imagining what you want the painting to look like at the end, but also knowing you can't control the paint strokes. You know, the fear was just, I got to bring up a black boy in Mississippi, which is a tough place to bring up kids, period. But there are statistics that say black boys born after the year 2002 have a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison. And all three of my sons were born after the year 2002.
So, Dad, why do you take me to protest so much?
I think I take you for a bunch of reasons. One is that I want you to see what it looks like when people come together, but also that you understand that it's not just about people that are familiar to you, but it's about everybody. Did you know the work that Martin Luther King was doing was for everybody and it wasn't just for black people?
Yes, I understand that.
Yeah. So that's how you got to think. If you decide that you want to be a cab driver, then you got to be the most impactful cab driver that you can possibly be.
Are you proud of me?
Of course. You my man. I just love everything about you, period.
The thing I love about you never give up on me. That's one of the things I will always remember about my dad.
You said it like I'm on the way out of here or like I'm already gone.
So, Dad, what are your dreams for me?
My dream is for you to live out your dreams. It's an old proverb that talks about when children are born, children come out with their fists closed because that's where they keep all their gifts. And as you grow, your hands learn to unfold because you're learning to release your gifts to the world. And so for the rest of your life, I want to see you live with your hands unfolded.
I still get teary. I've watched this about 4 times now, and it's, yeah, that's a wonderful dad and an amazing kid. The way Paul describes the old life of sin is all about grasping and never opening the hands up. It's about scarcity. It sees life. It sees God's gifts as pie, and if someone gets a bigger slice, then it means I get a smaller slice. God's grace is not pie. God's grace is infinite, and there's always more. The land of scarcity, the land of grabbing onto what is mine, and grabbing as much of other people's stuff as I possibly can. That's the land we packed up and left through grace, through faith, through baptism. We moved to with apologies to Paul Simon, we moved to Graceland.
Instead of Sinland.
Instead of Sinland.
Yeah.
That's kind of tacky sounding. I don't know. Maybe we'll have to find another metaphor. But when we're in Graceland, Paul, at the very beginning of our reading in chapter 6, asks the logical question in the more direct translation, what then are we to say? Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? In other words, hey, we have forgiveness, so woohoo, let's go be horrible and let's go be ugly and mean and stupid and greedy because there's forgiveness. Paul says by no means. I remember when I think back to my 12-year-old self in the canoe, after that lesson in forgiveness, rescue, and forgiveness and grace, the next time my parents went out to an evening, my first thought was, hey, let me do that stupid thing again. Let me go get caught in a storm on the wrong side of the cove. No, it's not a matter of, oh, I respect the rules more or I learned my lesson more, but I have a relationship with this amazing dad who taught me a wonderful lesson wordlessly. Why do I want to mess that up more?
Which I think is what Aiden's saying when he says to his dad, I'll always remember that you never give up on me, right? He knew that that relationship was there. He's very wise for a 9-year-old.
He's very wise.
And we know in the same way that God never gives up on us, even though we go back to visit that old land of sin time and time and time again. God never gives up on us. And that makes me want to be the most impactful person I can be, whatever it is that I'm doing. And I think when we understand that God is determined to be with us and to love us and to shower us with grace and challenge and even more grace, we want to be the most impactful people of faith, people of love, people of grace that we can be. It's not about going back so God can forgive us more. It's about going forward with God into a new land of grace.
So when we have experienced that grace, we don't take advantage of it. We give thanks, we learn, we grow, we deepen, and we move on further and further into that new country, that grace land, what Wesley called sanctifying grace.
Are you done?
Nice.
And so our prayer for you this day, our prayer for ourselves, our prayer for the world, is that we might learn how to live with unfolded hands, that we not try to hoard our gifts to ourselves, but that we live with unfolded hands. Because that, I believe, is what God calls us to do. And again, I'm grateful to this video for reminding us of that so beautifully. I'm glad for the opportunity for us all to remember that with each other this morning. So grace and peace. And one of the gifts with open hands, I believe, is our next music piece, which is from a friend of mine who runs the musical program at an Episcopal church near Boston. His name is Andy Clarkson. We used to know each other when we were kicking around in the Adirondacks together, making all kinds of musical mischief together. Andy just sent this piece to us that his choir had put together and said, if you can use this, use it. And so we'd like to share it with you. And during this piece, if you'd like, you can send prayer requests in on the Facebook feeds, though given that we had the technical glitch this morning, we may or may not see them. So if you send it and it doesn't get lifted up in prayer, again, know that God knows it, and our apologies in advance. But first, enjoy this piece from Andy Clarkson and his choir.
Rock of my soul, of my soul, of my soul, of my soul, rock of my soul, of my soul, of my soul, of my soul, rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham, rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham, rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham, oh, rock of my soul, my soul, oh, so high you can't get over it, so you can't get under it, so wide you can't get round it, so rock of my soul, my soul, my soul, rock of my soul, in the bosom of Abraham, rock of my soul, in the bosom of Abraham, rock of my soul, in the bosom of Abraham, oh, rock of my soul, my soul, my soul, oh, rock, 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 my soul, I'm singing, rock, rock, my soul, oh, rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham, rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham, rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham, rock of my soul, rock of my soul, oh, rock of my soul, oh, rock of my soul, rock of my soul, rock of my soul, rock of my soul, oh, rock of my soul, 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 rock of my soul,
Thank you, Andy, for that wonderful rendition of Rock of My Soul. As many of us remember, it was Juneteenth, a couple of days ago, a recognition of justice denied, and a recognition of freedom still to be perfected. I invite you to a time of prayer. Prayer requests are coming in. I invite you to continue to write those down. We'll have a time of prayer. And then I'll share some prayers from the Essex folk. Barb will share some prayers from Morrisville, and we'll finish with the Lord's Prayer. So I invite you to breathe deeply of the Spirit. Breathe deeply the sweet scent of grace, just like this rose that came out of the garden today. Breathe deep of forgiveness, of freedom, of grace, inclusion, and love. Loving God, we give you thanks for this new day. We give you thanks for the gift of grace that Paul celebrated and we continue to bathe in these many years later. Recognizing that you are the God who does not give up on us, even when we seem homesick for the land of sin. Recognizing your steadfastness, you might give us the courage to unclasp our hands, to offer up our gifts, to share with all our brothers and sisters, and to use open hands to help create the kingdom that Jesus spoke of, lived out, died for, and whose resurrection is the promissory note on that which is to come. We are still a people with clasped hands, with a tight grip on so much because we don't feel safe, we don't feel loved. Oh, reassure us, loving God. And we lift up those who are in pain. We lift up those who are sick. We lift up those who need to hear of your grace. And so this day, with Catherine, we pray for the Spalding family, Catherine's sister-in-law, and the death of her brother Joe. With Dwayne, we pray for all of us who tremble in this period with misgivings as we try to discern the new ways of loving connection and grace and serving. With Liz, we just ask for love, peace, grace, and safety for all of Earth's inhabitants. With Roger and Kathy, we lift up that today is World Refugee Day, and there are some 65 million displaced persons. And we know the incredible conditions many of them live in, even in our own nation. We lift them all up.
We also continue to lift up Betty Harvey in hospital. Warren and Kathy Miller as Warren heals from his surgery. We remember the life of John Nutting, who was the Vermont UCC conference minister for many years and who will be having a Zoom remembrance on the 24th this next week. We remember Dana as he continues to have cancer treatments, and also Carol's neighbor Lois, who has liver cancer. And we lift to you Gary Hazard as he looks towards tests this next week. And we continue to lift to you, God, all those who struggle with illness, who struggle with anxiety, who struggle with loss of job or income, who struggle with too much spare time and too little spare time in all of these COVID and protest days. May there be life and love and grace and forgiveness in their lives and in ours by the power of your Spirit. And we join together in the prayer that Jesus taught to us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Thank you again for joining with us this morning. Apologies again for our technical glitches. And just a couple of announcements for the Morrisville Church this morning. This week on Tuesday, the reentry team will be holding another follow-up meeting as we look toward ways for our ministries to go forward in the future. Wednesday at 7 p.m. again, I'll be doing a spiritual practices for uncertain times. Reverend Becca Gurrell and her family are in the parsonage, and I want to remind you on her behalf and behalf of the Pastoral Relations Committee that she's not working yet. So they've gotten moved in. In fact, this morning is her last Sunday with her Lebanon church. And so they're doing their quarantining, they're doing the things that they need to do to transition in. So by all means, you could certainly wave at them if you see them in the yard, but give them the space they need to get settled into the house. And there will be ample instructions on how you all can be welcoming to her in the coming weeks. So watch your email for that. How about for you?
I want to let folk know that all three of our reentry teams, the ones that are working on ministry during COVID, on outreach ministries, and on in-person worship at sometime in the future, are meeting, making plans for the possibilities of outdoor worship, either picnic style or drive-through, drive-in. And how we're doing outreach both within and outside the church. One new piece that is coming out of that is starting on Wednesday night. We'll have time coming to you soon. We're going to be starting a study of the book White Fragility. And Melanie is going to be leading that discussion. And so you can find that on the newsletter or email me or Melanie if you have questions about that. So we're excited about, I wish that were in person, but we're excited to be doing a study on white fragility and privilege.
And we're still planning to start reading together the book, The Hate You Give. We're waiting for books to come to us from the Vermont Council on the Humanities. So thank you to those of you who writ me and said, I want to be part of the book group. It's in process and it's coming. So just to let you know that. Anything else?
I think that's what we have.
So why don't you give us a good word to go out on this morning?
The fancy word benediction just means a good word. And I invite you with open hands to go out into this beautiful Vermont summer day. If you're in Vermont, if you're elsewhere, go out into whatever day there is with hands filled with the good gifts God has given you, and share them with everyone you meet, doing it all in the name of the God who is creator and redeemer and sustainer now and forever. Amen.
And at the end of our time this morning, we have music played by Sean Boer and recorded by Clark Callender. I love to tell the story. May you have a week of peace and grace. Amen.
Amen, y'all.